Hello and welcome to Round the Table, number 44, from the meeting point here in Bilbao, broadcasting not only to Bilbao but around the world. It's a cold weekend here in Bilbao, so I'll try to find a nice summery, slow TV background for you, and maybe some nice birdsong sound effects as well, why not? This week we've been discussing the topic of guilt, and it's been a fascinating discussion this week in all of the groups. We've been discussing why laws are not the same in all countries, and if there are moral laws that should apply everywhere, and how morals change from one country to another, and how morals can change over time. So we decided that if we were to go back into the days of slavery, we would probably go along with it and not protest too much. And our moral viewpoint of today does not necessarily apply to times gone by, which then begs the question, what will we be judged on in the future when future generations look back at us? And we decided that there could be a lot of improvement to be made on subjects like gender differences and rights, and animal rights might be a big thing, not to mention the way we are treating the environment, which we generally feel future generations might hate us for what we're doing at the moment. So that's something to think about. We also discussed what responsibility we have, how much guilt we should feel for things done by future generations, with regard to things like slavery, for example, and if heads of state should apologise to other countries for historic crimes, or at least what to us in the modern world appears to be crime, but obviously at the time was not. It was just one country conquering another, which was the way things were done in those days. Is it necessary to apologise? Does it actually do any harm apologising? And what's the point of it? And connected to that same question, we were also discussing how we often look at people in the past from our same nationality who did great things, and how often we find a connection to those people and say, oh, look at us, weren't we great in the past? Look at the wonderful things we did. But when there's something terrible like slavery, we somehow disown it and say, well, that wasn't me, I wasn't alive, that wasn't my family. But the trouble is it could have been your family, because if you think about it, every generation, the number of ancestors that you had doubles. You got 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. You only have to go back about 500 or 600 years to have 1 million ancestors. So you could have been descended from the slave owner, you might be descended from the slave, or possibly both. And the great moral question that we left till the end of the lesson was number 10 on the page here, which is kings or prostitutes, who holds the moral high ground? This phrase, the moral high ground, to hold the high ground is actually, I believe it's a military expression. To hold the high ground would be to be in a superior position. So to hold the moral high ground means to be morally superior. So the question of kings or prostitutes being morally superior, everybody said prostitutes. Without even discussion. There was not even a pause for thought. Everybody said prostitutes morally far superior to anyone in the monarchy, which was an interesting conclusion. So let's look at some of the vocabulary that we had come up this week. We've got some interesting words and also phrases. A lot of these are collocations, like the case would go to trial. You might go before the judge. Go before the judge. Now this has confused some people because most people think of before being a question of time. But in some cases, not so much these days, but before can also be in front of, like in physical position, like you stood before the cathedral, means you stood in front of the cathedral. which reminds me of the story of the judge talking to the accused, and he said, "Is this the first time you have been up before me?" And the accused said, "I don't know, Your Honour. What time do you usually get up?" Yes, that is a funny joke. And then, of course, we had the word proof, a type of evidence. You have evidence, you have proof. Proof does not come in a plural form. It's not countable, so you can't have proofs and you can't have a proof. It's just proof. The verb is prove with a V, so don't forget that's another pronunciation thing with a f and a v. Proof, prove. Then that evidence that we have has to prove beyond reasonable doubt. This is the expression, beyond reasonable doubt. Then the jury, that's the group of people of 12 jurors, they have to reach a verdict. And then the judge will pass sentence. Sometimes the accused is not really the guilty party, but sometimes the evidence has been manipulated or manufactured by a corrupt policeman, in which case the accused has been framed. Framed is the expression used in the criminal language. "I've been framed." Or set up is the phrasal verb, meaning the same thing, to set somebody up, or it's a setup. And then we have the word scapegoat. A scapegoat is somebody who is found guilty of something because we need somebody to blame. It's an old biblical expression. You can look up the origins of that one. It's an interesting story. Scapegoat. Yes, it's related to the word escape and the word goat. So it's when you find somebody to pin the blame on, who isn't necessarily the guilty person, but we have to find somebody. Okay, let's look at some phrasal verbs. So we've got a few phrasal verbs here. Lock up, put away. These both mean the same thing. When you send a criminal to prison, you can lock them up, you can put them away. If they don't get punished, or they get punished very lightly, we can say get off. Get off. There's also let off. Let off is when you do it to somebody else. So let off is a transitive one. So the judge let him off means he didn't punish him, or the criminal got off. So you might say that somebody caused a car accident, several people were terribly injured, and he got off with a small fine. Okay, so sometimes it's because you consider the punishment to be very small, too small, or no punishment at all. So get off and let off are very similar. You can also be called up for jury service. So when you get a letter in the post says you have to go somewhere to do something, it's to be called up. You can also be called up for military service as well. Here's a quick what's the difference? Set an example, give an example. To give an example is just when I'm saying, let's talk about phrasal verbs. For example, lock up. That's an example of a phrasal verb, so I'm just giving an example. If I set an example, I'm showing people how to behave, what I think is the correct way. Like if you're going to cross the road and there is the red man showing, sometimes if there are no cars, you are tempted to walk across the road when the red man says stop. But if there are small children around, it's always better to wait for the green man, because you then set a good example to the younger people. So setting an example is not the same as giving an example. And here are this week's typical mistakes. Not really connected to the topic of guilt, but these are typical mistakes that could come up in any conversation, really. There's one another and each other. They live near each other. They live near one another. Two expressions, people often get them mixed up and say one to each other or one other and various things, but those two phrases get mixed up. There's either one another or each other. Dinner, breakfast, lunch, etc. We very rarely use them as verbs. In some old writing, you might hear people say he lunched at 1 o'clock, but it's really unusual in the modern English. We normally eat lunch or have lunch. The same with all the other meals. We say eat or have as the verbs and then use the different meals as nouns. I don't mind, it doesn't matter. That's another favourite one to get mixed up with. A lot of people say it doesn't mind. But the thing is, I don't mind, or it doesn't matter. And of course, people. People are, of course, people are. Most people now have got to grips with this and say people are. But it's also those people. It's not that people. Okay, people is a very strange word, and you might have seen somewhere in the book this week, peoples with an S on the end, which is occasionally possible. Generally speaking, the thing to remember is one person, two people. There are more complicated ways of doing it, but stick to that. During the discussions this week, we didn't really get onto page 34 to go through these wonderful collection of quotations all about guilt and morals. And there are so many to choose from here because they were really good. But the one I'm going to choose is by Voltaire, and it is, "We are all guilty of the good we didn't do." That's an interesting one to think about, isn't it? Now let's have some news. We got two interesting news items this week. On Friday evening, we had a very interesting discussion on the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King. We went through the text and analysed how he uses repetition as a oratory technique, and also some of the amazing metaphors that he uses of the high places. He's very keen on high places and sunlit uplands and dark, despairing valleys and things like that. But it was a really interesting meeting. We had a few beers, not many. We were quite sober and sensible. We had an interesting collection of people from different groups, so it's always nice when we get a bit of a mix and match of different people from different groups, a chance to meet other people. And it was a very good meeting. Enjoyed it a great deal. And of course, next Friday there'll be another one on the 14th, and we've got another one coming up on the 21st because it was so popular. I thought possibly we might do two, but I didn't expect to be doing 3 meetings on the topic. But there you go. Very, very popular theme discussing the Martin Luther King speech. Coming up in mid-March, we'll also have another beer and tortilla event, which will not be involving any reading at all, just sitting around and chugging a few beers and discussing the world and chewing the fat, as they say. Chewing the fat. That means just talking about life in general. And then next trimester we'll have another reading thing. I've got a couple of short stories up my sleeve, if you know the expression, to have something up your sleeve, saving it for later. I think it's a gambling term for keeping a playing card up your sleeve. So that's something coming up. And also the other interesting piece of news is I've got a machine for making sausages. So this afternoon I'm going to make sausages, which seems like a very good way to spend a Saturday afternoon. So I have no further news. That's the topic of the week. Next week we've got isolation. We've done some of it before. The desert island question has been discussed before, but we've also got a whole load of other questions there to discuss. So, should be good. And have a good week. Till next week. Bye.